Hello. Let's try to be on time. Not too early, not too late. Thank you very much for coming, everybody, to this session that I hope it will be extremely interesting. We have here representation from three institutional settings, three institutional translation services. And we are going to learn a bit about vocational training of translators, on-site training of translators. I think that this is something extremely important for all of us because translators, like doctors, like surgeons, like bus drivers, like everybody these days, need to be retrained every day. And although we know that we learn by doing, basically, some basic training is still needed, and this is needed constantly. So I'm pleased to have three very interesting, in my view, I've seen them and I like them, three very interesting presentations. And let's start with the closest of the two cities, because we have a representative from Paris and from Luxembourg. We start from Paris. I guess it's closer because the train takes like half the time. It's not the same train. I mean, one is French technology, the other one I don't know which technology is, but probably it's 19th century technology, but it takes double the time. So let's start with France. We have two ladies, interpreters, they will speak in French, all the others and headsets if the other understand French. We have Sandrine PERALDI, who is the Director of Technology in ISIT. Did I say it well? ISIT? Yes, but as she tells me, she's has been, because now she's moving into UCD Dublin, so in January. So she's between two seats right now. And to my right, we have Julie, yes. Julie REMFORT from the MINEFI, which is the most famous translation center in France, because in Luxembourg we have another translation center. She works for the Ministry of Finance. So please, if you go to the lectern, I'll give you 20 minutes. You are being timed. By the way, if you have questions, note them down, because we'll go for a round of questions and answers at the end of the three presentations. We won't do it after each presentation.
Bonjour à tous, Julie et moi-même.
Good morning, everybody. Julie and myself, we're both really happy, absolutely delighted to be here. It's always a great pleasure to meet multilingual translators and specialists, and it's an additional pleasure today for us because we've got a very interesting project to tell you about, which we've been working on for more than a few months, indeed a few years, both of us. It's very important to us, and it's bringing together professional translation and the linguistics of the corpus. We're going to share this presentation, so we'll be going back and forth between each other. So, those are our names. We've introduced ourselves already. I've got a lot to tell you. I'll try not to be too fast to help out the interpreters. So, very, very quickly, because there's a lot to say, I'd like to start off by defining the linguistics of the corpus. We're all involved in this as translators, of course, to a greater or lesser extent, but we're not all familiar with the definition of the terminology. So, talking about this, we're referring to the study of languages based on the corpus. That's only logical. And it's the study of languages based on real, authentic, live texts, natural texts. With a microphone, please. If you, by the way, if the members of the audience switch their microphones on, they will extinguish, they'll switch off the microphone of the speaker.
Donc il ne faut pas pousser pendant qu'elle parle. Vas-y, pousse.
So, would you like to carry on? Well, thanks very much indeed. So, as I was saying, this is inductive and empirical in the approach, and the reason for that is that linguists, terminologists and translators don't just come up with examples which they think are used as such, but go back to authentic data in order to understand what the phenomenology of translation is. So, The translation and corpus relationships here are well known in terms of educational considerations, well known in terms of professional considerations. I'll sketch over this because it's so well documented. We use the linguistics of corpuses, of corpora to understand technical areas, and also to get to grips with definitions and that type of thing. I won't go into any more detail about that. What's less well known is the use of the corpus in translations. Now, this is basically based on teaching. We're talking really about the training of translators. And this is based on a relationship of contrasts here, which we're looking at. We look at the solutions and problems of translation. We look at the norms and strategies used in translation. And then we look at style and related questions to that. Just a couple of observations I'd like to share with you, which explain the origin of this project. I'm not only, by the way, a teacher, but a researcher. First thing, it's pretty well exclusive use of parallel use of the corpus. Where we're talking about the comparable text, you compare the target language, you compare the source language, and then you relate them to each other. It's basically, the corpus is exclusive use for training translators. That's its use. It's not used in the professional sector or the professional context, which I find surprising, because basically all the researchers are saying the same thing. They're all saying that the use of a corpus is excellent for the purposes of training translators. I'm going to give the floor to Julie, who's drawn a similar observation from the professional context. Well, as for myself, I was responsible for the computer language support pool, which means making available to translators tools which are useful for their purposes. So there are tools. And by the way, I'm a linguistic specialist. I'm not a translator, but I use the comparable corpus just referred to. And as far as the corpus is concerned, I found it was very, very useful. Corpora can be used to explore languages. So why not use these tools for translation? That's what I felt. My approach was this. Looking at the training of translators, the type of training proposed, we felt would be that the use of corpora would be useful to them. We felt it should be explained that this could be integrated into the range of skills of translators, into translators' training courses, but also we wanted to find the point in time when the use of a corpus is useful to the translation process. Those are the three main questions, and in Menefi, basically, we've got about 20 translators. They're all generalists. They cover basically the entire universe. There's an enormous amount of technical questions in these translations. They're long translations, they're highly legal in nature. And by the way, one thing I mustn't forget to tell you, this is a very small organisation, a small service. We have no Jewish linguists available. We do as well as we can, looking contracts, translating them. We've got revisers that help us with this, but we don't know whether it's right or not, because we're not legal specialists, and we don't work with these legal specialists, which is why I raise this question. What can we do about this? What approach can we set up in order to facilitate this question of this aspect of legal translations? Let me give you a first example here. When it comes to setting up of a corpus on brand licenses and intellectual property. By the way, we're focusing the experiment on a narrow area just to see if it works. This is no more than an experiment. So this was the approach. This is what we decided to do. So we've got apprentices, trainees, that work in translation. They're half-time at university, half-time in companies. They're great, these trainees. They've got a great deal of knowledge in theoretical terms, but they're well-educated children or students or young people, and when they go to a company, they just follow instructions. However, there's a lot that they're not aware of, and we feel that there's a lot of potential that we're missing here. So together with Sandrine, we set up this research project thinking that these trainees will be a great basis for extending their own knowledge if we work with them. So the corpus is based on this very narrow subject. They had to draft the corpus. Sandrine might tell us actually about what a corpus is and how you set it up. The next step was that they would work with themselves to see whether, as young translators, this project helped them do their work as translators. And then they would work together with professional translators to explain to those professionals whether they might find it useful or not. For example, would a corpus be useful to experienced translators or young translators? That's the type of process. And then also the chronology of this, which I referred to a few minutes ago. At what point in time the use of a corpus might be useful. By the way, Sandrine would like to talk more about this. Comparable corpora are very, very large volume, but in order to get hold of information, that's a very, very tricky thing to do. You don't just do it any old way. Well, there's a lot of documentation about all sorts, from all sorts of people, about the nature of corpora. Just let me focus on two important points. We've focused on the question of the objective. In terms of the objective and constituting a product, you set up a different corpus. You've got a different corpus in terms of editing assistance or in terms of dictionaries. We've also worked on the framework in which communication takes place, and that really does define the expertise of the author, the expertise on the part of the readers, which means you can decide what type of information is located in a particular corpus. The reason why I say that is that we decided to use an approach which is triple track. And we set up 3 corpora. And the reason for that was that we wanted to target our information as close as possible to the needs of translators, which means that translators answer the right questions. Do I need a definition here? Do I need to choose between 2 competing aspects? Do I need an equivalent? These are aspects of translation. The translator would say, I need this corpus because I'm familiar with this area. I need to get to know the nature of this concept better. That's why I need a definition. So we set up 3 corpora. First point, if you've worked in the linguistics of corpora, ours are very small. Generally, linguists use several millions of words. We only use 93,000, which might be a matter of concern to you. But these are, however, very useful points because they illustrate the problem of accessibility to data. We're going to be talking about this today. This is also related to data confidentiality, which I believe Julie's going to talk about as well. Very, very briefly, 3 corpora. Explanatory, English corpus, explaining the concepts, definition, etc. That's based on governmental texts, on guides, on glossaries and that type of thing. But using, as we do, the English legal system and common law, it was difficult for us to get the documents we wanted. But there's an explanatory French legal corpus, which is much greater. There's Legifrance. There's all the legal bases. There's so many of them, I can't actually recall all their names, but there's a lot in France there, which produced for us about 500,000 words, which was, of course, far more promising. And the third corpus, which we have named the corpus of phrases or phraseology, is much more limited. This is based on contracts for brand licenses only. And there it's very difficult for us to recover data because these are more or less confidential in nature. However, the results were extremely positive. We worked in this very narrow area, and our microcorpus, although it's very restricted, limited, is excellent, we believe, and came up with excellent results. So very, very briefly about this instrument, this tool, we used the sketch engine. There are a lot of corpus linguistic tools. We use the sketch engine simply because the graphic interface is relatively intuitive, user-friendly compared to others which are available. we're talking about setting up corpora here on the part of linguists for linguists. But what we've got to do is not upset the translator's context or ecosystem. Introducing a new tool into the translator's environment is a very big job. It requires a great effort. Firstly, because translators are under a lot of pressure to deliver, to produce. And that's why we have to be very careful. We have to be silky smooth in the introduction of this. We base this approach on 4 points: research of concepts and definitions. Secondly, the research and validation of translation hypotheses. The answers are not in the translation memory, but that's why we have to go to a corpus. Validation of equivalence and the use of collocations. Very, very briefly, therefore, I'd like to share a few examples with you. This is a traditional, very well-known classical example, so very briefly. We've used concordance, i.e. all the context around a particular concept, where we refer to the text in indices. For example, an apple would be a fruit or a sort of fruit, etc., etc. That's the sort of indication that we use. And then we move forwards to find a definition. The third context is a mark indicating that. That's a definition which is very useful for the purposes of a terminological dictionary. But another example, which is more interesting, I believe, for our purposes, is that we will work on the basis of limited license. The translation memory didn't have any information on that. We couldn't come up with anything on the internet either. So we conceived of 3 hypothetical translation: limited license, non-exclusive license, and restricted license. 3 alternatives there. And for that purpose, we use word sketch engine. The interesting point about that is that sketch engine is very sophisticated in using phraseology. What we've done here is simply look at the collocations which are categorized grammatically. In the first column, what do we have? Well, look there. Amongst the qualifying adjectives, we've got partial. Well, isn't that interesting? We clicked on that particular term, and what that leads us to is concordance with partial license, and one of the context also gives us a definition for this. Partial license, when the license only refers to part of the product or surface, etc., which means the corpus helped us to validate the equivalent or facilitated that step. Another example, looking at the hesitation between 2 competing synonyms for the translation of the term trade name. Firstly, non commercial or designation, and there we use the sketch diff or sketch gif. On this particular table, what this actually shows, although it looks a bit basic, is quite straightforward. What this shows is the measurement of the occurrence of the frequency of the collocation based on a specific term. So we compare the name or designation compared to the commercial area. Everything in green shows that the occurrence of these is much more numerous. When it's in red, it occurs less frequently. Yes, indeed. Thanks for that. Yes, the occurrence of the collocation, and therefore the name is associated much more frequently to the commercial term. That's what this table shows us, and the pretty straightforward conclusion is that you've got to use a translation of a commercial name, not a commercial designation. Look at further details of the table, and what you'll also see on the second line is that there's 47 occurrences, which leads us to the question of denominations. There's further questions that arise there. However, notwithstanding that qualifying comment, this was very helpful and confirmed our hypothesis. Another example, much more classical, is the management of phraseology. There, once again, you see that everything is categorized grammatically. For example, looking at the term contract, well, you can rescind a contract, you can conclude a contract, but also you might end up with a license contract, a subcontracting contract, and all sorts of other contracts, which means you've got a whole framework for the lexicology, a whole context, a whole field. And now I'd like to give the floor to Julie, who's going to offer some conclusions. Thank you very much. This tool has been shared internally with the translators, and as I was saying, there's a lot of risks here translating legal text where we've not had a tool to help us verify our work. And we felt that this was really a guarantee for translators. It gave translators a security in their work. It meant that they could verify what they're doing. It's not just a matter of going onto the internet and spending some time. It's a question of having confidence in the corpus that's been set up. That's very important, shouldn't be underestimated. That means the translators need to know the origin of the corpus, where it came from. And I've got to emphasize that point. Given that first step, they're reassured about being involved in this process and using the corpus. So, positive feedback on this tool. The trainees also were involved in the whole process, involved learning how to use these tables and decoding them. It may not appear easy at first sight. It's actually quite straightforward, but it had to be learnt. Another step in the process there. And we felt that based on this success, we could carry on doing this work. It had achieved positive results and was welcomed. The translations that were produced were more idiomatic on the basis of these tools. And by the way, we're talking about general translators. They're not experts in a particular sector, but it meant that they could use the idioms that helped them become closer to the specialized area that they were working in. But furthermore, it was added value compared to what they'd been using hitherto. The problem, however, is the time spent in getting to know and how to use the tool here. And another point, which we've not looked at, is how this tool can help the translators work on their hypotheses. I mean, if you've got several hypotheses, you can validate them, but how do you set up a first hypothesis, the original hypothesis? Can the tool help us with that? We don't know. It's an open-ended question. It might be an unanswered question because it's such a limited corpus. We'll have to see, further work to do. Conclusions. We've started an experiment which turned out to be positive. More work to be done. One question is whether the comparable corpus can be used by terminologists in their work in terminology. For example, if you are able to identify markers of defining context, where, for example, you might have a or a form of, etc., etc., and if you understand that there are defining milestones or landmarks in particular context, can you define a context of the text so that you can end up with a definition which will complete the list of terms and definitions you've got? That's something which is available and useful to terminology experts. Another question is whether we can achieve better definitions and a richer approach if the corpus is larger. And the last question is how this tool integrates into the whole range of tools available to translators. That's an enormous question because translators don't have time to waste. You could actually get bogged down with too many tools. And the problem here is you've got to really choose the right tool, and the right tool is something which helps you produce a good translation, verify it, and at what point should you use that tool and call on it. These are anything but straightforward. In other words, we need a landscape of when and where you do what. We need to map this whole situation. Moving on to further conclusions on skills and competences, the idea here is that this could be used by revisers. This could become an ad hoc dictionary. In other words, it might be useful in those purposes. Further potential, we've got to explore that question. Another important question is that if you use a corpus, somebody's got to produce it. And in order that the translators have confidence in the corpus, the person producing the corpus must be an expert. And that means we need terminologists to do this work. And the microphone. So there's just a technical problem with headphones there. So what we've got to do there is become aware that there are specific areas of risk here where the terminologist will set up the corpus, make it available to the translator, and that will aid also an acquisition of information science technologies as well. So that was very, very brief, very, very compact. Thanks very much indeed for listening. Thank you.
Merci, mesdames. And now back to English. I'd like to introduce you a translator from DGT. We are going back, we are taking the train once more. We go to Luxembourg now, and the first stop is by the station, and close to the station works this, my friend Claus LARSEN. He's a translator, but he's a translator who's been specializing in the last years in training of translators, in training around translation memory, about CAT tools. And I think that he's going to introduce a very nice scheme that they have to train translators in the use of CAT tools. Please, go ahead.
Thank you, Josep. Yes, well, I'm Claus, as I was just introduced, and I'm a translator and also language technologist, and as such, I'm a member of a small team that develop and deliver training to our translators, and that's training in the use of CAT tools, so that's my special field. I'm going to give you an example of skills mapping in the public services and what we've done at the Directorate-General for Translation at the Commission. Now, you may or may not be familiar with the concept of skills mapping or competency mapping. There are several different models for that purpose, and this is just one model. It's not the one we've followed, by the way, but any model typically includes a mechanism to reveal some skills gaps and a mechanism to fill those gaps, typically through training and professional development. Another model, which is from our own world, the world of translation, and some of you may remember it from yesterday when Pia showed exactly the same model, I think. It's from the EMT, European Master in Translation, and they call it the Wheel of Competences. It's still the old model. I know that in EMT they are looking into updating the competencies for translators, but still this one gives a good impression of, well, the 5 core areas for translators, for translation service. And of course, if you look at from, well, what can we say, from 6 o'clock to 7 o'clock, that's technological competences, right? And that's an important area for translators, I think you all agree. But why skills mapping at the DGT? Well, I'll just like to give you a little bit of background information because for a long period of time we were using a very simple tool, a simple CAT tool based in Microsoft Words, and actually until 2013. And then we migrated to a modern CAT tool, and many translators found themselves in trouble. They would have to learn to work in an editor, for example, rather than working in a native application, just to mention one of the things. And of course, the multitude of things that you can do with a modern CAT tool compared to what they were used to, you can just imagine what kind of challenges that would bring about. So the lessons learned there, well, not surprisingly, of course, there was a need for migration training to make sure that all our translators, and there's 1,500 of them, that they would be able to work with the new CAT tool. So that was one lesson. Another lesson learned was also that in the future it would be much better for us as a service to make small adaptations and upgrade whenever possible, take on board new tools whenever possible, rather than having to close such a big gap. And now, of course, the reason for this is not only because we used one product for a long time, but as you know, the development in CAT tools and translation tools in general has really accelerated and is still really moving fast. So those were the lessons learned, and the challenge that we stand with today is, of course, now everybody can work with it. Well, as I said before, we want to make sure that we don't have to close such a big gap again. And to take the last thing first, the technology watch that we actually call the Kate Lab was set up, which is sort of, well, it's a lab where translators can come and try out any new tools and propose new tools for testing, new features, functions, plugins, and so on. Well, if we find them useful, then we'll look into it if we can acquire them and integrate them into our translation tools environment. And it all happens in, well, it is sort of a protected environment, but still it looks exactly like our working environment. Then, of course, the continuous need for follow-up or advanced training. Because as I said before, we are more than 1,500 translators. And of course, you know, they have varying skills when it comes to IT. There is a big difference in age as well. We have old translators approaching retirement. We have many newcomers as well. So how to make sure that everybody will be able to work with the tool efficiently? That was one of the challenges. And of course, there's also some, there are some, well, just give you some numbers here with the number of translators. I've mentioned that already. So I'll just skip that one. Okay. So we decided to build a skills catalog, and simply to go through our workflow and describe what we do from, well, only with the CAT tools, of course, because that was what it was all about. And then identify all the typical tasks that we work with and describe them, and simply to define this is what we need to be able to do. Of course, then prepare some flexible training modules. Flexible also meaning short here, because we have many translators who, well, all translators are busy. And there are always translators who say, well, I don't have time for this. So something, I don't know where that slide is. It's not in this presentation. Okay. Anyway, there are translators who will say, well, I already know enough to do my work, for example. So, well, yes, maybe it's possible you work with the basic functions, but you could be more efficient. You could perhaps ensure the quality if you used some of the additional tools. And then there are translators who say, well, we are too busy to attend training. And that one reminds me of a cartoon that I've seen of two persons from the Stone Age. And they were like pushing a wheelless barrow full of stones. And then a guy comes up to them with a set of wheels offering some help. And they say, well, no, we're too busy. And of course, this is exaggerating, but still, you have to invest some time. But we settled for very short modules. They are typically from, well, around 2 hours, so people can get back to work. And we planned them so that there are a number of modules. And if you already know you can follow one module and then it's followed up by a different module, but if you already know those features, then of course you can go back to work. If not, you can stay over. So we try to make it possible to integrate it into well, people's, what can we say, the time that people have at their hands. Okay, so now let me just show you. Obviously, it's an online one. The catalog is online, stored at our intranet, and it's interactive. But here I'll just show you a couple of screenshots for it. So the way it works is that, well, you can see here in this case, it's part of the standard workflow from the translation phase. And every time the user, I don't know if you can see it, but there are small, on the left there are small arrows, and if the user clicks there, he or she will see a description of one particular skill. And in this case, it has to do with translation results, what kind of sources they can come from, and how do I find out which one is the best source, and so on. Then you also see that there are some color codes on the left, the pink and the yellow, and what do they stand for? Well, we've categorized it into important, or according to importance. Because there are features that everybody must know how to handle, and then there are features that only a number of users will need anyway. For example, if you go to the color is not quite true here, but it's greenish, and it says it's needed occasionally, for some projects only, or by some translators only. And I think that's an important exception, because we have many special kinds of documents, and some of them only end up on a few number of translators' desks, so there's no reason why everyone should be able to master such a skill if they never use it. But then, of course, there are the ones like the first one that you need every single day. So much for the importance, for the categorization according to importance. If the user, well, how does the user use this catalog? Well, in principle, the user will go to a page and go through the different skills groups, because they're grouped according to what the subject matter is. And simply skip, because if the user says, I know how to do this, this, skips through it until he or she reaches a point where, well, here there's something to learn. And let's just imagine that this was here, and then it's about handling tags, which I think also Peter mentioned this morning in the session, which for some translators is sometimes quite a tough one to handle. But as it says here, it's important to know that some tags are essential in order to produce a target document. Learn how to recognize these tags. And then how to get the knowledge. Well, there's always two options. Either there's a link, or there is a link right here to our user guide, which takes the user to that exact specific feature, section in the user guide. Or there is a training option. So training, in this case, handling non-translatable text, handling tags, locking segments, that's module 8. Okay, so they are grouped into module 8. And then if the user clicks on the training link, the user will be taken to our online commission platform for training. So the same thing here. And the moment that the user will click on training, will be taken to this, which is EU Learn. That's what our internal training platform is called. And then the user can see if courses are available, and if they're not, then he can express interest, and then will be notified once one of the that particular module is offered. And how to keep track of training? Well, all the trainings at DGT are registered in the Commission's training catalog, the EU Learn platform. So it will always be possible to see which modules have I followed, which ones do I need to follow, perhaps. And also for the management, we have annual appraisal exercises, that is called, so a written and an oral evaluation, so to speak. And one of the points there would be training and development. So for a head of unit, for example, it would be possible to look into what the job holder has followed, what kind of training, and if some gaps need to be filled. So what's the result of this? I'm not sure you can read the details on this slide, but it simply shows that there are some modules that are more popular than others. It's not a surprise. And the one with most popular here is actually the one that well, shows more or less the whole technical workflow that we have, internal workflow that we have at DGT. So actually one participant said, this module has changed my whole professional life. That was nice feedback, right? Okay, and well, generally the uptake, the interest has been very high. But I think, as in any organization, there are a number of curious translators who will always say yes to any kind of training option if they feel they need it, where others need sometimes to be pushed to enroll. So some translators have followed virtually all the modules, and probably also translators who haven't followed any yet. We've had this system since April, so let's see. Good, so that concludes it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Claus. I think we are all excited about this. I can imagine already some questions for the ladies and for you upcoming. And now that we are in Luxembourg, we go to the other side of town, to the Plateau de Kirchberg, where the banks are and the parliament is. And from there we have Rodolfo MASLIAS, who is the supremo of terminology in the parliament and one of the big figures in terminology in Europe. So he will talk us about training of terminologists in the parliament. So Rodolfo, without further ado, please go ahead.
Micro, you hear me? Okay. So I will start from the mot de la fin of the two ladies, saying that the terminologist might become scientist in information, might change his profile. And really this is the subject that I want to talk about, especially as a follow-up of the European Summit of Terminology that we organized last year in the Parliament, of which this was a main subject. Terminology is in any presentation present, and in any software, it is the only error category that is present in all systems for translation quality assessment, because terminology is always the most important factor as resource and as quality assessment, so ex ante and ex post. And in the European Parliament, we are conscious of the big importance of terminology for the quality of translation. And this is why we have created in Digitrad the Terminology Coordination Unit in 2008. And we organized terminology based on a terminology framework that sets the responsibilities of this coordination unit and of the translation units. So how do we work with the translation units? We don't have full-time terminologists in the Parliament. We work with the translators. Of course, since it is a political institution, we are very much in contact with the committees and we follow the work, the political work. So we have coordinators for the legislative files and thematic groups. And in each unit, we have a group of terminologists. According to our framework, it is minimum of 2 terminologists in each unit. So translators assign the tasks of terminologists. And in some units, we have up to 8 members of these teams. So these terminologists make our terminology network that has today more than 110 members with whom we work. And we have also every 3 months so-called rotating terminologists from one unit working as full-time terminologists with us. And this permits us to keep contact with the evolving needs of the translators. We have some Parliament-specific projects, of course, like the rules of procedure of the Parliament, like every institution has. One of our main activities are the so-called term folders, so we prepare terminology and the translator receives an active link to the term folder containing data from IATE, the database of the European legislation. And we have also cooperation with other DGs, other Directorates-General, to harmonize terminology in all languages, in all software used, for example, administrative software. Then we have cleaning projects for IATE, because in a database sometimes it's more important to clean the legacy data instead of adding, and this becomes more important now that terminology is coming into the CAT tools and gradually also into the machine translation. And finally, we have university projects that we coordinate with a lot of universities in Europe, permitting the professors and students to work in terminology for IATE as if they were members of our units. So we have a lot of tasks in communication in 4 layers. First, within the Directorate-General of Translation, where the terminologists work together with the coordinators and with the translators. Then, as I said, with other Directorates-General, and it is important our cooperation with the lawyer linguists or legal revisers, as they are called in other institutions, with the interpreters and with the parliamentary committees. Then we have an interinstitutional cooperation that is governed by a group called IATE Management Group, managing also the database IATE. And finally, we have in the Parliament a very extensive network with external contacts, and this is done with through our website, which is the unique public website of the European institutions on terminology, and its address is termcord.eu. The cooperation and communication is done nowadays online, and it is done on unit level between terminologists and translators. It's done with a terminology forum between the different units and different languages, and between institutions with a terminology portal that we have called YourTerm, and that contains also a language wiki for each language, giving also access to national experts. Another communication task is, of course, training. We provide very different kinds of training to newcomers, to trainees. You know perhaps that each unit has 3 trainees for 3 months, so hundreds of trainees are passing from the European Parliament. Then we have advanced trainer for terminologists, and we also give training in other institutions on request. So why should we review the terminology skills? Because the translation needs have changed very much, because the tools have changed, and because the profession of translator has changed also very much. It is important to specialize nowadays because competition is very high in the linguistic sector. So we are coming to so-called terminologies, a kind of professionals for big institutions that are specialized in terminology. They are computational linguists, translators, or localization experts. The challenges in reviewing the terminology skills are huge. The new terminologist must be aware of terminological working methods. It is more important than ever, also for drafters, because, for example, in the Parliament, with its more than 700 members, it's very important that the drafters, who do not draft usually in their native language, use the terminology resources. Then the terminologist needs to collaborate and cooperate with the different actors. And finally, he or she has also to be able to evaluate the impact of the tools we are using. So what skills are needed now? Of course, we need a competence, a knowledge in the languages we work, but also a competence in linguistics and field-specific languages, a competence of management of databases and glossaries. For example, in the European Parliament, we have a software called Glossary Links, where we monitor the web, and we have collected and evaluated some 8,000 glossaries for research in specific domains of legislation. And this is terminology that cannot be in one database, not even in IATE with its more than 11 million of terms. Then an ability to collate and create terminological resources for specific purposes or target groups, a competence in standardization, and also to be able to provide prescriptive terminology, so to choose the normative terminology to insert, for example, in the CAT tools and machine translation, and descriptive terminology, which means to collect and get the terminology used in the member states and insert it in the databases. Finally, technical skills, of course, because we use now the CAT tools. A terminologist must have a knowledge on terminology management systems, on computer-assisted translation. We are now able to download terminology data from IATE in TBX format and to create term bases in the CAT tools while translating. Then we use term extraction tools to prepare terminology for the translators. Then a proficiency in the use, creation, and management of terminology databases. And finally, a larger competence in every information field, like ontologies, the connection between the different fields, data fields and structure, big data, semantic web, etc. Then also communication skills using now the new tools. A terminologist must know, for example, the netiquette, which means how to behave in the cyberspace today. So what you can write, the confidentiality, data safety. They need an ability to liaise with experts. Also an ability in teamwork and networking, because nowadays terminology, it is sharing, as it was said today. It is a pity with all the possibilities that we have that we don't share terminology and that each one creates its own terminology in fields where you can find more specialized people and databases. Also for what training they can have. Nowadays in a lot of universities you have masters in terminology, you have specific courses, and we have in our unit specialized trainees in terminology, and I can tell you that we really learn a lot of these young people who come with very high skills and offer really knowledge that we don't have, because we are full-time terminologists, but we are translators. And this is why, as conclusion, we think we have counted that nowadays in the European institutions there are some 180 colleagues working as full-time terminologists. So there are a lot in the Commission. There are all the members of the central coordination units in all the institutions, in 13 institutions participating in the management group of IATE. And all these colleagues are not translating anymore. We are working in terminology, and we think that it is time that a special job description is included in the EPSO competitions, and in the European Parliament, starting from our unit, we are taking such an initiative, and we hope that this way we will provide another alternative to our to young people in the linguistic sector who want to specialize in terminology. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rodolfo, and all the speakers. I think it's very interesting what we heard today. I come out with one image here, and is that machines are the future, because all of them talked about machines. I mean, Rodolfo was the one talking a bit more about the translator who doesn't translate, because I also retain this sentence: we don't translate anymore, and until we understood who he was, and we is his group. I thought we don't translate anymore, but that's an interesting change with respect to other situations in the past. All this spears a lot of questions in me, but I imagine that you are not interested in my questions. We are all interested in your questions. So I'm taking questions from the floor, and I hope that our presenters will be able to reply to all of them. So who wants to break the ice? Okay, icebreaker is down there. The lady in glasses, please go on.
Hi, I'm a translator, a quality coordinator, and a former terminologist from the Commission. And I can't quite agree with you because I think all three speakers actually talked about terminologies today. So it looked like, you know, machine translation technology and so good. But the future of translation is machine translation plus terminology somehow. So this is something that probably the machine will not figure out by themselves, so we have to help them. So my question will be how to kind of integrate this terminology work and the results of the terminology work into the translation workflow, including machine translation, translation memories, and so on, to have the best results. How do we do that? Do we already do that? And if yes, then how?
Well, I know that we don't have them, but there are already machine translation systems that are actually able to what can we say, enhance the results of machine translation, actually looking into a term base. So I think that is one example where you actually do get the terminology that you already have and which you know you're going to use for a particular translation, and where it's taken into account in the use of machine translation. So I don't know exactly how it works because, as I say, we don't have it, or I haven't got it, but I know that it exists.
And Rodolfo, you continue, and then Sandrine wants to say something.
If I can add something, by coincidence, yesterday we had cooperation with the developers of very interesting projects that was supported by the Commission. It's called PROMISE, and it will give the possibility to work and compare different machine translation systems. So, for example, the Commission's one, the Google translation, and the DeepL that somebody of you might use. And there we were exactly discussing of how to integrate IATE, which the new version of IATE will have now. We'll have now APIs and a lot of web services to be connected with any new machine translation tool. And as I said, what is important is not only to insert terminology in the machine translation as a resource, because this is the easiest thing. The most important thing is to integrate our data in the ex post quality assessment. And this is more difficult because there you really need normative terminology. So we have to avoid the noise. We say noise, all these multiple choices which are given. So the translator needs to have an accurate solution quickly and in the system. So, but I think all institutions are working on this, and also all researchers in universities and all companies on the market.
Let's see the university, what has to say.
Yeah, very quickly. First of all, I would just like to specify something. It's true that we have been talking about corpus-based tools today, but I mean, without the linguist, the terminologist, or the translator, nothing happens. I mean, we are using, there's statistics there, there's linguistic data, but we are the one interpreting it. And so we are the one making the work. So it's true that it's easier because we get to work on 100 million words, but at the end of the day, we are the one making the decisions and deciding what translation, what equivalent, or what term we are going to be using. So I think we are actually still quite far away from a kind of machine-oriented approach. As regards the tools, some other specialists in corpus linguistics tend to think the same. We believe that it might be interesting to have some kind of I don't know, a convergence trend between CAT tools and corpus linguistic tools, because obviously today it doesn't exist. I know that Rudy Locke, for example, who is a specialist in translation, in corpus-based translation studies, and other people, researchers working on this, we all think that there should be some kind of merging phenomena between, because obviously this was one of the, when we were working on our projects with Julie, the very first concern of our translators was like, but we don't have the time to do the corpus, and we don't have the time to learn a new software. How are we going to deal with that? And so if we manage to create a tool that enables us to have CAT tools, concordances, and why not machine translation? It already exists between CAT tools and machine translation. That would kind of be the perfect tool, I'm guessing. So there might be something to do with, I don't know, SDL, with other companies, and see how we could work on that. Even if there are some functionalities in CAT tools that already tend to go towards corpus linguistics. So yeah, I don't know if you know. Good. Okay. Thank you.
So thank you. Any other questions? Yes, the lady in red.
Good morning. Thank you to you all for your very interesting presentations. My name is Catherine. I'm here on behalf of the European Union Intellectual Property Office. We're based in Alicante. We're actually translation clients rather than translators. We rely on the translation center in Luxembourg for all our translations. So we have a very small team of linguists who are working on translation revision, quality assurance, and terminology. We're a bit like your organization, Claus. We've just started with CAT tools. We're far behind you because we started last year. I have a question both for Claus and for Rodolfo. Claus, as you can imagine, my question is the EU Learn platform open to the EU agencies? Are your modules there available? Would our linguists be able to go on and do those modules? Are they online modules? So can we do them from Alicante instead of having to travel? That's one question. And for Josep, Rodolfo, you said one of the points you made was how important it was to make the drafters aware of the terminology. I'd like to know how you're doing that. And my final question for you is about prescriptive terminology. Is there any policy in place for prescriptive terminology at the Commission? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. No, not so good news, because there's no access. I mean, even if you could get the modules, I must say that they are written to follow our workflow. So although many of us are using the same CAT tool on a daily basis, the way that we've integrated it into our existing workflow differs quite a lot. For example, one of the things that I think all the major institutions do is that they have an integration client of something, an API that will grab the original from the server, from the file system, create projects, import translation memories and so on, and at the end it will export, in our case, to Euramis, which is where we store all our translated segments, and it will of course, upload the final translation and so on. So that's the context that all our modules are written in, actually. You will probably have to do something else or something similar, I don't know. Thank you.
So yes, for the drafters, there is our technical services are developing software called Xenat, which will permit the drafters to access the resources. We are creating a server that is called FullCat, and this is why the European Parliament had the need to develop a known CAT tool called CAT for TRAD, and for the reason that Studio used by all the institutions doesn't cover multilingual texts. And in our case, we have a lot of amendments that start in Italian, continue in Polish, they add some Greek and finish in English. So we have developed a known CAT tool that is based on a server of resources called FullCat that will contain Euramis, IATE and some other resources. So this server will be connected to Xenat, used by the drafters, and while they are writing, it will provide to them an auto-suggest function with the term in the language. So this is for the drafters, and for the question if there is a policy on prescriptive and descriptive terminology. We shouldn't talk about a policy in the Commission or in the Parliament, but in a general policy among us institutions managing IATE. There is not really a policy, but there is a need. In the beginning, we were creating terminology in the European Union because all our legal acts were new things in new fields. Now it is 50 years that the countries are working with our legal acts, and they have a very accurate terminology in their language, and there are some institutions like the European Central Bank and the Court of Justice who have a very close cooperation with the national respective bodies, the national central banks and the national courts respectively, and they get the terminology from there. There are also other problems, for example, in some languages in German or in Greek for Cyprus and Greece, and in German for 5 countries that have German as official language. In each country there is another terminology used. So a good database needs to have all the different versions. So these are needs that lead us to combine prescriptive terminology that can be, the prescriptive can be only the normative one, meaning the titles of conventions or the titles of bodies. They have to be translated in one way. So this we can impose, let's say so, but for the rest we have to get to enrich in a good way our database.
Thank you. Thank you. I heard a commercial name. If there's a pressing writer, please suppress the commercial name from the proceedings. Any other question? Michael, Olaf Michael.
Thank you. Last year at the Terminology conference in Luxembourg, there was quite a bit of talk about using linked open data, giving meaning and normative meaning to terms, phrases and things like that. I found that at this Translating Europe forum, there's almost no mention of that. Are you working in the background to attach meaning to your corpora, to what's in there? Not only meaning in terms of what the form of speech of a particular phrase or word is, but also, as you just said, Rodolfo, whether a particular term is normative in Germany, in Austria, or in Luxembourg, etc. Is there anything happening in that regard? Are you working with people like the BONET people? And again, that's not a commercial term, that's a university, should be considered. Sorry, thanks.
The new IATE, version of IATE, which will be in production and totally public in October 2018, has foreseen all this, also ontologies and connection between fields, and this will be, it is our developers team are working on this. It's background work, as you said.
I would like to make a bit of propaganda for my last employer. The Publications Office is working on linked open data. That's really what they day in, day out, and there's a lot of the development in this domain. Also in Luxembourg, but that's just close to the station. One last question, because we must go off for the wrap-up. Yeah.
Bonjour, je suis I'm a translator in Geneva from the Translation Agency. My question is as follows. Is there an international body that coordinates and validates terms and terminology within international institutions? Or is there no such coordination body across the different institutions and the various linguistic departments? Thank you.
Oui, comme j'ai dit.
Thank you. As I said, for the EU institutions, we have a body that deals with the IATA database. IATA has an in-house version, and you need the EU login for that. But there's also a public version, which has more than 8 million terms. And there's an average of 3,500 clicks hourly. In order for a term to be entered into the public IATA, it's validated by all our terminologists across the institutions. And because of the options out there, we have cooperation with the terminology portal that I referred to earlier. And that provides not just resources, but also a collaborative platform. And through that, we can work on common projects. For a term to be in the public IATA, it's validated. And then automatically it's updated at midnight into IATA Public if there's a new term entered. If I may add to that, I'm also operating in the international environment. So I would say that the Internet has a lot of assistance that has allowed us to mutually help each other. The 4 duty stations, I'm not sure what the French term is, the duty station in Nairobi, Geneva, Vienna, and now they're starting to manage terminology together. But AMBI and WIPO has 3 different databases because there's 3 different departments. There's a lot of work to be done across terminology, and terminology has never been the key concern there. It's more so the declarations and resolutions and the like. But communication and modern communication has allowed us to make some headway, and that's where technology can help. And to sum up what we're saying here, technology and humans are working hand in hand. Becoming more robotic. I don't know. It's whether the machine is becoming more human or the human more machine-like. But I'll conclude on that note.
And let's go up to the wrap-up.